So in community, the essay, Community, What Type of Entity and What Type of Moral Commitment, Professor Harris advances several important and illuminating claims and arguments on the topic of race, which, by the way, I'm not a specialist on, and that's in particular why I want your correction. Those prompt my reflections today. First, he holds that, quote, believing in the universal salience of race as a categorical or continuum variable is deeply misguided. Second, he proposes that, quote, racism is a way of killing by viciously robbing the assets and opportunities of one population for the benefit of another. I take it that the first claim is equivalent, to use Harris's words again, to the proposition that, quote, races are not stable ontological entities. The second claim is elaborated by specifying that the killing and robbing of one population by another actually should be conceived transgenerationally and or transhistorically. It concerns, crucially, the very means for crafting a transhistorical reality of persons and goods via multiple mechanisms for transmission and legation. I'm going to call the first point Professor Harris's ontological thesis about race, and the second Professor Harris's thesis about racial predation, with specific reference to American black persons here. My aim here is to present some speculations, my wonderings really, about these two important theses advanced by Harris. And these speculations are, I would say, Deleuzian in flavor. So I want to see if these speculations juxtaposed to Professor Harris's positions and arguments have any interesting bearing on those positions, or if they might be contested by his views instead. So either way, it's appeared to me, at least so far, that on these 2 points, the two philosophers, Deleuze and Harris, may have addressed corresponding problems, even if it turns out that they did not propose identical solutions to them. So, racisms and races. Deleuze and Guattari offer an account of European racism in 1000 Plateau. There they argue that, quote, the race tribe exists only at the level of an oppressed race, and in the name of the oppression it suffers. There is no race, but inferior, minoritarian. There is no dominant race. A race is defined not by its purity, but rather by the impurity conferred upon it by a system of domination. Bastard and mixed blood are the true names of race. I take this to mean that the concept of race just is the concept of a subordinated race, as we'd have to put it, using terms that they are here contesting. And I'd like to try and explain their thought and propose some reasons for which I think it might be interesting, but I need your testing of it. So there's a proviso here that I'm not supposing that identifying a quote-unquote theory or logic of racism, as Professor Harris warns against, would enlighten us about racism on a global scale. Deleuze and Guattari do expressly name the racism they examine as European racism, and as for the time scale they're thinking of, I'm not entirely sure. The main idea in this Deleuze-Guattarian position is that a conventional view that there are dominating and dominated races is a ruse, and it would be more than a logical or conceptual mistake to affirm or believe it. It would be a political and ethical failure to do so. So many thinkers have held that in various systems of oppression, there's one uncoded dominant member that's hierarchically superordinated in relation to others, of course. This superordinated member serves as a model of humanity, or being one sex or another, or being one race or another, or being a religious believer, one religious believer or another, etc., etc. So the thought goes. And then the value of this picture is thought to be that it exposes the inaccurate or unjust implicit setting of a standard or a model that's inachievable and biased, which are not the same things, against all of other members of the hierarchy. In the case of sex, the argument goes, male human beings were taken both implicitly and explicitly to represent human being or humanity per se. Likewise, in the case of race, the biased elevation of the white person, capital W, as the model of humanity per se, or human excellence or moral virtue, or the summum of what a human being can be, has held sway, this argument goes. And it's easy to see in both cases what sort of injustice this would be. But Deleuze and Guattari point to a different thought pattern at work here. They argue that exclusion from a racial spoils system is not quite apt to characterize European racism. Persons are racialized in this system, they hold, instead, in reference to what they call an average ordinary white man, capital W, capital M. Here's how they describe European racism, again in 1000 Plateau. If the face, I'm going to not go into all of the Deleuzean technical terms here, so just read through those. If the face is in fact Christ, in other words, your average ordinary white man, then the first deviances, the first divergence types are racial. Yellow man, black man, men in the second or third category. European racism, as the white man's claim, has never operated by exclusion or by the designation of some other. It is instead in so-called primitive societies that the stranger is grasped as an other. Racism operates by the determination of degrees of deviance in relation to the capital W, capital M white man face, which endeavors to integrate non-conforming traits into increasingly eccentric and backward waves, sometimes tolerating them at a given place under given conditions. From the viewpoint of racism, there's no exterior. There are no people on the outside. There are only people who should be like us and whose crime it is not to be. Racism never detects the particles of the other. It propagates waves of sameness until those who resist identification have been wiped out, or those who only allow themselves to be identified at a given degree of divergence. Its cruelty is equaled only by its incompetence and naivete. So, I do think the language of Christ as the average ordinary white man is not silly or ridiculous. I think that it refers to the divine fraternity of Christ with human beings, since Christ is a sibling of all human beings. It's the basis for it's one of the fundamental bases for the notion of fraternity, that there's a fraternal relation between Christ and all human beings. So the averageness, the incarnate averageness of the fraternity of Christ makes a lot of sense in the Western imagination. But something immediately sounds contradictory or strange here. How are races, on the one hand, only dominated or subordinated races, while they claim those races are dominated on the basis of their degree of deviance from a white man's standard? Well, talking about a white man's standard seems to imply the existence of a race called white. The way I understand this, though, is based on my supposition about the context of US racism and what I've taken to be a ruse of racism in the United States. By ruse here, I mean the simultaneous operation of competing propositions or practices about races, which simultaneous operations permit various feints, illusions, denials, self-absolutions, whitewashings, and quite apparently, increasingly in recent weeks, what I take to be duplicitous, self-righteous attacks on non-white people and peoples not only in this country but far afield. It seems to me that Deleuze and Gunther's view becomes clearer if we consider it in light of two competing images or views of race. And I'm not really tagging these two particular authors, although I think that can be done. Maybe naively, I think that can be done. The first view holds that there's a serial identity of races. On this view, as I typically put it, a race is a race's race. That is, any human is a member of a race, and groups of humans can be formed on the basis of race similarity, although races are differentiated and differentiate human beings. Insofar as each human being has a race, each human being is identical on this view. That is, everyone's equally raced. Having a race or being a race in itself does not differentiate humans, although races differentiate racial groups of humans. Then the political corollary that customarily flows from this identity of being raced is the imperative of absolute equality of treatment in relation to this alleged human feature. Because all human beings are equally raced or of a race, no recognition of race as racial differentiation is warranted. So now I'm trying to capture one particular view there. But there's a second view that matters, I think. The second view is that there's some kind of hierarchy of races. And races are superordinated and subordinated in a ranked system of moral or political value. But importantly, the way I'm conceiving of this is that one essentially takes the first view of race, that is the serial identity of races, and then conceives of the hierarchy as stemming from the addition of a qualifier to each race in the series, subordinate or superordinate. So my point here concerns how the hierarchy is conceived, namely by addition of a qualifier to the noun race. I point this out because I intended to mean that the noun race on this second view preserves its meaning and then just varies by relative position that is, in relation to the other elements in the series. Persons are still the same as raced, but they're not the same in terms of the position of the race that they are. Superordinated races are just as much races as subordinated races here on this view of hierarchy, and vice versa. And I don't think this is useless hair splitting yet, because I'm trying to see it as a way to distinguish Deleuze and Guattari's view from this second view, the hierarchical view of race. So the first view is, there's a serial identity of races. Second view is there's a hierarchy of races, but it's built on the first view. It's built by modification of the first one. So the second view might be attractive because it seems to allow one to express the kind of predatory relations between some racialized groups, or maybe I should say raciated groups, that we find in the US context and which Professor Harris vividly depicts. I'm not saying that this is Professor Harris's view, by the way, only that the second view might seem appealing because it could recognize some of the same brutal realities that Professor Harris describes and decries. But I think that one risk of the second view is that it's built on the first, or at least, according to my description of them, it is. That is, this hierarchical view is built on the serial identity view. And so when we appeal to the second view, the first view is present in its substrate, if you will. This hierarchical view, in other words, conceptually contains the unranked series of identical races, races that in themselves are unranked and then positionally ranked. The subtle point is that race itself, what the noun allegedly names, does not itself become ranked here. Rather, its pluralized instances of race, that is, races, are ranked in relation to each other. But the concept race itself contains no sense of ranking. This is what I mean when I point out that the first definition is embedded in the second. That is, the second definition still relies on the unranked sense of race. This is plain to see, since we understand what the qualifier in the hierarchical version of race is doing. It's ranking races. The proof by contradiction is that if ranking was instead built into this concept of race itself, if superordination or subordination were intrinsic to this use of the concept, then adding a qualifier to specify that a race is subordinate or superordinated would be redundant or nonsensical. But on this view, the added qualifier is considered neither redundant nor nonsensical. We understand it. So it must be that the term or concept race here does not itself have the sense of being ranked built into it. The ranking derives solely from the added qualifier on this sense of race in this hierarchical view of race. But what is the import of the first view being built into the second view? I think there are a number of problems with it, but a couple present themselves starkly and repeatedly. The combination of these two views produces the following constant misfires in racial reasoning and social hopes. First, based on considering the first view to be ontologically descriptively accurate, a morality and politics of match to reality ensues. And the mantra is, everyone is equally raised, so to treat everyone identically is to treat everyone justly. And there's a long catalog of objections to that view that are too many to enter into here. Secondly, the first view is used descriptively to strike down objections to racist social patterns, to exactly what some statistical pictures of the social salience of race show as a hierarchizing fact. The mantra here is, everyone is in fact equally raised, so any apparent social injustices cannot be explained by being raised. The third one is, then since the first view denies the brutally racially patterned realities of life, death, and health that Professor Harris so aptly exposes, the typical rejoinder, based on the second hierarchical view, then arrives. Yes, but it's more complicated than that. Races are ranked. So keep races, but effectively strip the ranking qualifiers from the noun race to achieve a just society. Perhaps we can now see or make some sense of the move that Deleuze and Guattari make in relation to these two views of race. For I think we should view their position as a rejection of both these accounts. They reject the plain serial identity of races and the alleged moral imperative of strict equality that purportedly stems from it, as well as the flatly descriptive use of it. They reject the second view as well, namely adding positional ranking to that plain serial identity. The, quote, cruelty, incompetence, and naivety associated with these views serve to refute them. But in favor of what and why? Deleuze and Guattari reject these in favor of an attempt to rigorously identify the concept as it has functioned, to kill, among other things, in the West. It's easy to see how their view differs from the first view, serial identity, so I won't enter into that here. But let's distinguish it from the second view, where there is more apparent overlap, since both use the notion of subordination. Most importantly, their view finds that the demotion or subordination is just built into the concept of race as it has operated in the West. So subordination is pointedly not adjoined to the concept of race. It is rather intrinsic to it in the European uses they find of it. The term race just means subordinated race. The cruelty is coming from inside the house. Why take this view? Well, it's not in the interest of policing word usage. I speculate rather that it is for urgent anti-racist purposes and an effort to avoid the cruelty, incompetence, and naivety of the notion of race they've encountered. Their view, in fact, blocks or prevents all of the misfires I described above. If subordination is built into race, both the first view and the second view are untenable. Now, not only is subordination built into the concept of race for them, but perhaps puzzlingly, there's no dominant race. So this stipulation also differentiates their notion of race from the second view, since you'll recall that the ranking of the hierarchical concept included both superordinated and subordinated races. I think there's several reasons why they claim there's no dominant race. First, because the predator people who wield the concept of race to live off of others, while claiming that the lot of their prey is self-caused or is the result of chance distribution of events, themselves are not required constantly to live through the parameters of the salience of their racial classification, which is a very well-known point. But in addition, the standard or model against which these races as subordinated are measured is fabulated. Quote, Christ, in other words, your average ordinary white man. Again, I don't think it's silly because it's very precisely rooted in Western theology and iconography. But we should note that it's not the members of the predator race who serve as measures against which racial deviance is charted. Thank you to John for reminding me of this important point. Rather, it is this fantastical ideal, like the sundial's gnomon. The gnomon itself of the sundial is not an hour or a time, yet it appears on the plate where the hours may be read via its shadow, and it determines when they are. Likewise, the average ordinary white man appears in the field of races, where races may be read on persons, and it determines the distance of those races from itself. However, it is not a race, but a pure socio-ordinal point that distributes social facts of race by distance from itself, but is not itself a distributed point. It is the oriented points of an ordinal or intensive scale. It's the mercury in a thermometer, not any measure on its tube. And so to consider average ordinary white man to be the set of all existing white men, or any given white man, an instance of a dominant white race, would be to mistake the mercury in the thermometer for the temperature it indicates, to mistake the gnomon for a reading it permits. However, one might suppose, cherishing a version of the conservation of races of Du Boisian or Lockean or some other flavor, that there are excellent reasons for preserving at least some races, including reasons that bolster the health, well-being, and lives of people who have been made prey by other people. I think that Deleuze and Guattari would be eager to say that in those cases, one is certainly not using the concept of race as it has been used by the exterminating peoples. So yes, if conservation would mean to continue to experiment and to create new means for making trans-historical connections, their view would certainly not oppose this at all. This just wouldn't be conserving race, as it has been wielded as a racist weapon, and that intrinsically for them is what race is. There's no unranking it, there's no making it superordinate either in the Western context. In other words, whatever it is to people who were prey, whatever it is people who were prey have made, it's not race. They were made prey through race. Now, this might sound harsh, but it also might just sound like following the trail where it leads. Race isn't salvageable, but it doesn't need to be, because innovative, guileful responses to being made into prey exist. One doesn't put the tainted torch to pure, fresh use. One lights a new torch. So race and lineage, if I have to have a little bit more time, maybe not, just 20 minutes, 3 minutes. If I've understood correctly, the characterization of racism as one population killing and robbing another population, and making that population what it is in central ways, and co-making what they themselves are. That includes the important correlation that I'm thinking of in terms of predation. That corollary is that the killing or exterminating population is living off or seizing the life of that population and putting it towards its own life and well-being. So extermination by itself, for Professor Harris, is not the only phenomenon here. In addition to the gargantuan violations that extermination is, there's also the profit it brings to the killing population. So that's why I'm thinking of it as a kind of predation, a killing that feeds, edifies, or nurtures those killers, and I know, and he does use that term at some point. Now the actuarial approach to depicting here is necessary in my view, first because I'm assuming the definitions of racism such as Harris's meet with self-defensive and sometimes violently reactive denial or incomprehension, skepticism, or dismissal that trivializes and scuttles its importance. So when the evidence is evidently not evident, to some, speaking the language of statistics might vivify the situation for them. Second, because even if the extermination portion of the view is at times acknowledged, demonstrating the predation is a separate task, I would think. That is, demonstrating that white power is predatory and not merely cruel, vicious, punishing, retributively and distributively unjust, but also sustaining, that is, sustaining and nurturing the exterminating race. This is another sort of explanatory project, it seems to me. I do think that actuarial reckoning is critical for actual reckoning, in other words, and Professor Harris has, I think, forcefully shown this in his work, I take it addressed mainly to philosophers. But I'd like to ponder a question raised by his highlighting of this particular relation of populations related by predation. If the mechanism of immiseration is indeed predatory exclusion from a beneficial system, and that's not Deleuze and Guattari's view, but if the mechanism of immiseration is predatory exclusion from a beneficial system, and if that beneficial system is to be surpassed, a set of problems arises. Or if the benefits stem precisely from this predatory exclusion, then inclusion alone does not look like a solution. How accede to a system whose benefits stem from predatory exclusion? The issue arises when the benefits of a system actually depend on a kind of exclusion. In that case, dependency indicates a predation, but we're going to simply advocate inclusion as the solution to this violative situation, that would leave a problem too. For inducting prey persons into the system in a way that then benefits, let's say, formerly prey persons, raises the question of whether prey are necessary for the system to benefit its members or not. If prey are indeed necessary for benefits, then including prey would just produce the need for more prey and other prey. If prey are not necessary for benefits, then some of the exterminating system's benefits clearly vanish, and so much the better. Eliminating white supremacy in the US case in social, economic, political, cultural, linguistic, and religious life means that the property in whiteness elaborated by Cheryl Harris, among others, can no longer be a distributed, contrived benefit to those whose social aspect is white. So the above question becomes, can a system of predatory exclusion be made to bequeath a new non-predatory order? And I think that Professor Harris's account of the death of racism in his paper Necro being an actuarial account of racism takes an important step in that direction. I don't think that Deleuze sees that evolution in terms of negation, but he would share the aim for the death of racism as I do. To conclude, I think Deleuze and Guattari would agree entirely with Professor Harris that, quote, races are not stable ontological entities, and objective raciated communities do not form an ontological entity. I think, though, that like Professor Harris, they still found it urgent to think about the social operation of the notion of race in order to trace its functioning in the regimes of racism that they knew, and I hope I've shown a bit about what seems like a distinctive way that they have done so. Thank you very much. Sorry for the speed.
Thanks for your paper. This is sidelight. Maybe we should talk about this later, but I was fascinated by your use of the gnomon as an illustration of racism. And I was thinking about Sayre's discussion of the gnomon as that which knows and as a knowledge that lies outside of human subjectivity.
Yeah.
And wonder if that would allow you to also characterize race as this constructed kind of a regime of knowledge or a discourse that lies outside of human subjectivity, but just is structured in that way.
Yeah. I mean, I hadn't really connected it to that as well as I should have really, but and I've said it because I have just worked on Deleuze's notion, Deleuze and Guattari's notion in in What is Philosophy and in the cinema books about the, let's say, the inhuman contribution to human knowing. And so he uses the idea of the veritas sine eye, and so the eye of the camera, and he uses the idea of the conic section, where the only way the conic section really works is to sort of implant an eye at the top, at the apex of the conic section that's sort of looking down. That's the perspective from which the sectioning takes place. And so I have written about the sort of inhuman, the technology of the inhuman perspective or the inhuman point of view, whether it's the editing or montage in film, or it's the, yeah, you could say the Steadicam that goes where no one can go, no human can go really, or whether it's the perspectival eye at the apex of the conic section. I have thought about that, but I haven't actually connected it in this sense, or I could say that there's a putting to work of these kinds of social perspectives that are inhuman themselves. Yeah, I'll have to think more about that. Thank you.
Okay, listen. I was listening to you talk about Deleuze and almost like the race metaphysics, and I like the division you made between like serial identity and hierarchy. And it seemed as if you were leaving space to talk about races without a sense of hierarchy, that even though they can be used in that sense, there's a unfolding or a deployment of it in a way that is not necessarily attached to that.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
So when I'm trying to explain their view, their view is that there is kind of impersonal logic to the European, and maybe Euro-American, that's I'm not sure of, to the European use of a concept of race. And the duplicity is when you have a descriptive claim that there just are races, and that so that is a metaphysical claim, and one which I'm not taking a position on here actually, but since I know it's very, I've heard a lot about that over the years, and I've read about a lot about it, but I don't have a position on that. But the duplicity is just to the duplicity is this for them. They don't think that that what's operating in the concept of race is a plain unranked conception of race. So they think there's no room. I did talk about conservation of races at the end, and so I think that's probably why and I did want to leave room for that in a way. But I think it just would be something for them, something else besides race. So they're going to take race and they're going to say, look, it's a notion that intrinsically in Europe, intrinsically is about killing, and it's intrinsically about subordination. So that's built in. It's not like there's race and then you could add on
So they
dominant
disagree
and
with Du
subordinate.
Bois?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. They do disagree with Du Bois and many other people who say like, no, there's race and then you can do lots of things with it.
Right.
And they're like, nope. This is the tool. This is the tool that was made to do this. Now, if you want to do something else, you'd have to call it something else, or it would be something different. Maybe it would be like a descendant of race that's countering it or something like that. But if it's a little bit closer to the kind of somewhat ambiguous Audre Lorde claim about you can't dismantle the master's house with the master's tool, but it's a little bit closer to that in the sense that they're going to say this is this term is a weapon and only a weapon, but it's got a ruse attached to it, which is that it's not a weapon.
Right.
Yeah, so it's that first part that's like, it's not a weapon, everybody has one, and a race is a race is a race. So go with that, right? And they're like, no, that is, don't be fooled. That is not at all. That's part of the ruse of race, is to say like, everybody has one. Same thing, you can do the same thing with sex, actually. But they're saying, absolutely not. This is a weapon, and that's what it's meant to do, and it's a killing weapon. So if you try and say like, but no, you could have race is neutral, and then you could add on subordinate, superordinate. You join the adjective to the beginning of it. So race is neutral? No. They're like, no, subordinate is built into it, and superordinate isn't even a part of it. That's the kind of weapon it is.
Whoa. Cool weapon.
Sorry. So I mean, if there's a Du Boisian conservation of race position, they would I think they would have to say, well, I mean, it's no longer European race that you're talking about. Yeah. You created something else. Right. Don't call it the bazooka when it's a flower. Like
right.
yeah. I think that's the way they would go. But and Du Bois would be like, well, I don't want to give up that word. I don't want to give up that term. Or Locke, I don't want to give up that term, and I want to cultivate the cultural reality that's emerged from these centuries and centuries of war. I don't know. Is that clearer?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you for your question.
Next question.
So thank you for your paper. I would think, so based on what you just said, I would think that like something like racial eliminativism would be the emergent view, from the view that race is sort of necessarily incorporates subordination. But then, of course, still in the context of minoritarian becoming, you talk about becoming black as a category.
Yeah.
And so I'm just wondering, does minoritarian becoming, in the context of becoming black, like what do we do with the category of black there in light of your paper?
So two things. One, I don't think that their view issues in like an Oppian kind of racial eliminatism. So when his view, if I understand it correctly, is you want to eliminate race talk, race categorization on the grounds that it's fundamentally false. It purports to refer, but it doesn't refer to anything that we should think is real or endorsed, right? So
I was thinking more like Harris's, where it's like, as far as I understand it, which is that it necessarily involves invidious discrimination, and therefore should be eliminated.
Yeah, for Professor Harris, I think that, so for them, I think, yes, but it does relate to, I mean, I alluded to this at one point, but I didn't develop it. It relates to the question of the becoming language, I think. So I think that the becoming language, becoming dash, all kinds of things, but minoritarian things. So becoming minoritarian is their move to try and get us out of the ruse of race as I've described it, and to get us out of, I think, but it is a conceptual linguistic move to make, to say, well, actually we need to refute it, not just because it doesn't, in an Oppian way, it doesn't hook up to reality or something, but because it's it only is a corrupt tool for cruelty and injustice, and that part of the metaphysics of it that it applies is being a race, so, or being a sex, etc. That it sort of refers a little bit back to what the hypothesization that Alan was referring to. That yes, you could try and pull the rug out from under it by focusing on non-teleological double becoming instead of metaphysics of being. That's clear, but I don't think that's the whole proposal. But I think that's a part of it, definitely. So to me, that language is to try and break up the hold of the kind of ruses that they're trying to identify. I don't know if that makes sense. Chris.
I'll keep thinking
Yeah.
about it.
Well, thank you very much.